The crisp autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves through the open windows of Colonel Robert Steele Caldwell's Virginia home. At 58, Caldwell still maintained the rigid posture of a man who had spent decades inside the confined space of an armored vehicle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his living room as he leaned forward in his leather armchair, eyes fixed on the television screen. The History Channel documentary about Sherman tanks in World War II had captured his complete attention. The standard Sherman was reaching its limits, the narrator intoned, as footage of German Tigers rolling through the European countryside played. Something had to change. Caldwell nodded slightly, his weathered face reflecting both agreement and a deeper, unspoken knowledge. As a former tank commander who had led armored battalions during Desert Storm and later served as one of the Army's foremost experts on armored warfare, he understood better than most the documentary's simplified narrative. The telephone's sharp ring cut through his concentration. Caldwell reached for it without taking his eyes from the screen. "Caldwell," he answered, his voice carrying the graveled texture of command even in retirement. "Colonel Caldwell, this is Dr. Eleanor Hughes from the National Army Museum." The voice on the other end sounded both professional and excited. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." Caldwell muted the television but kept his eyes on the frozen image of a Sherman tank facing off against a German Panther. "What can I do for you, Doctor?" "Something extraordinary has come into our possession. A collection of classified documents from 1944 was recently declassified and transferred to our archives. They concern a project called Thunderbolt Duel." Caldwell felt a slight tightening in his chest. "Thunderbolt Duel," he repeated, the words awakening something distant in his memory. "Yes. It appears to have been a direct comparison test between the British Firefly and American Easy-8 Sherman variants. Given your expertise on armored warfare and your published work on Sherman tank development, we thought you might be interested in examining these materials. They've never been made public before." Caldwell's mind raced ahead of the conversation. The Firefly versus the Easy-8, the two most significant evolutions of the Sherman, each representing different philosophies of tank warfare. One British, one American. One focused on firepower, the other on balanced performance. It was the kind of historical material that scholars of armored warfare dreamed about. "I'm more than interested, Doctor. When can I come take a look?" "That's the thing, Colonel. There's something else." Dr. Hughes paused. The commanding officer of the American contingent in this project was Lieutenant Jack Caldwell. Given your name, I wondered if there might be a family connection. The world around Robert Caldwell seemed to stop. The muted television, the autumn air, the comfortable familiarity of his home, all faded into the background. "Jack Caldwell was my father," he said quietly, feeling the weight of those words. His father had served in World War II, that much he knew. But Jack had rarely spoken about his wartime experiences and never mentioned anything about a special project involving Sherman tanks. "I thought there might be a connection." Dr. Hughes's voice softened. "Colonel, these documents were sealed for 75 years. They contain field reports, technical assessments, personal correspondence, and photographs. Your father features prominently in many of them. Would you be willing to come to the museum tomorrow? We'd value your professional assessment of the materials, but I also thought you might appreciate seeing them for personal reasons." "I'll be there at 8, Caldwell replied, his mind already wandering to the small box of his father's war mementos in the attic, a box he had examined countless times without finding answers to the questions that had always lingered between father and son. The early morning light streamed through the tall windows of the National Army Museum's research room as Caldwell bent over the first box of materials. Dr. Hughes, a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes behind simple glasses, watched respectfully from a distance as he lifted the lid. The scent of old paper and time rose from the box. On top lay a black and white photograph that immediately seized Caldwell's attention. A young man in an American uniform stood between two Sherman tanks, one with the distinctively long barrel of the 17-pounder gun that identified the Firefly, the other with the wider tracks and revised suspension system of the Easy-8. The young officer's face was serious, contemplative, showing none of the bravado often seen in wartime photographs. Caldwell recognized his father immediately, though he had never seen him this young, this unburdened by the experiences that would later shape him. "That's him," Caldwell said quietly, more to himself than to Dr. Hughes. "That's my father." He turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink on the back was, "Lieutenant Jack Caldwell, Thunderbolt Duel Assessment Team, September 1944. Caldwell placed the photograph carefully on the table and continued through the box. Field reports, technical specifications, test results. The documents painted a picture that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his father's war service. He wasn't just a tank crewman, Caldwell murmured as he scanned a memorandum bearing his father's signature. He was the American commanding officer of a special Anglo-American assessment team. He was responsible for evaluating the combat effectiveness of both Shermans. Dr. Hughes approached the table. From what we've pieced together, your father was one of the few American officers specially trained on both American and British tank variants. The Thunderbolt Duel project appears to have been a comprehensive field test comparing the Firefly and the EZ-8 under combat conditions. Caldwell nodded, his eyes still moving across the documents. The question facing the Allies was which Sherman variant to mass produce for the final push into Germany. It wasn't just a technical question, it was a matter of national pride for both the Americans and British. He looked up at Dr. Hughes. This would have been politically sensitive. Extremely, which may explain why it remained classified for so long. She gestured to another document. There are indications that the results of your father's assessment directly influenced Allied armored strategy for the remainder of the war. Caldwell felt a complex mixture of pride and loss. Pride in discovering his father's significant role, and loss for all the years when this knowledge might have brought them closer. My father never spoke about any of this, he said, not once. Dr. Hughes nodded sympathetically. Many veterans of that generation didn't, but he kept this. She handed him a small leather-bound notebook that had been stored separately from the other materials. His personal journal from that period. It was included with the official documents. Caldwell accepted the journal with reverence, feeling the smooth, worn leather that had once been held in his father's hands. The small book seemed to vibrate with untold stories. I need to find out more, Caldwell decided, looking up from the journal. Not just what's in these documents, but the full story. There must be others who were involved, or their families, people who might remember. Dr. Hughes smiled. I thought you might say that. I've already started some preliminary research. She handed him a folder. Margaret Wilson is still alive. She's 78 now and living in London. She's the daughter of Colonel William Wilson, the British commander who worked alongside your father on the project. Caldwell opened the folder to find a photograph of an elderly but sharp-eyed woman standing before a museum display of a Sherman tank. And there's more, Dr. Hughes continued. Frank Thompson is 92, living in a veterans home in Pennsylvania. He was a technical sergeant on your father's team, the only surviving member of the original Thunderbolt Duel assessment crew. Caldwell felt a sense of urgency growing within him. These connections to his father's past wouldn't be available forever. I need to speak with them, both of them. I thought you might. I've taken the liberty of contacting Ms. Wilson. She's eager to speak with you. Apparently her father often mentioned yours. And the veterans home said Mr. Thompson would welcome a visitor, especially one connected to Lieutenant Caldwell. The museum seemed to fall away as Caldwell contemplated the journey ahead. Not just a physical journey to meet these connections to his father, but an emotional one into a past that had remained hidden for decades. He returned his attention to the photograph of his young father standing between the two Sherman variants, and for the first time noticed the insignia painted on the Firefly's turret, a lightning bolt striking through an iron heart. Thunderbolt Duel, he whispered. What were you really doing, Dad? 3 days later, Caldwell sat in the common room of the Keystone Veterans Home in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The room was bright and clean, with large windows overlooking well-kept gardens. But it carried that indefinable institutional quality that no amount of homey touches could quite disguise. Frank Thompson wheeled himself into the room with surprising vigor for a man of 92. His thin frame seemed almost swallowed by the wheelchair, but his eyes were clear and alert beneath bushy white eyebrows. He wore a crisp button-down shirt with a World War II veteran's cap perched on his head. Colonel Caldwell, Thompson said, extending a gnarled hand as he approached. You're the spitting image of your father. Has anyone ever told you that? Caldwell shook the offered hand gently, feeling the paper-thin skin over surprisingly firm bones. Not often enough, Mr. Thompson. It's an honor to meet you. Frank, please. Mr. Thompson makes me sound like my father. The old man gestured toward a quiet corner of the room. Let's talk over there. Fewer ears and the sunlight's good. These old eyes aren't what they used to be. Once settled, Thompson studied Caldwell with open curiosity. So you found out about Thunderbolt Duel after all these years? Just recently, Caldwell confirmed. The documents were declassified and transferred to the National Army Museum. I have so many questions. Thompson held up a hand, and I'll answer what I can. But first, tell me, what did Jack say about it? About the project? Caldwell felt the familiar pang of regret. Nothing. My father never spoke about his war experiences, at least not the specifics. I knew he served in a Sherman, but that was about it. Thompson nodded slowly. Doesn't surprise me. Jack was always tight-lipped about the important things. Said that words cheapened certain experiences. He adjusted his position in the wheelchair. But he taught you about tanks, didn't he? You became a tanker yourself. I did. Commanded an M1 Abrams in Desert Storm. Jack would have been proud of that. Thompson smiled, though he'd probably have said the Abrams had it too easy compared to the Sherman. Both men shared a knowing laugh, the universal understanding between those who had commanded tanks in combat. Frank, I need to understand what Thunderbolt Duel really was, Caldwell said, leaning forward. The documents give the technical details, but not the full picture. Thompson's eyes took on a distant look. It started because of the Tigers and Panthers. The Germans had us outgunned, pure and simple. Our 75mm pop guns on the standard Shermans couldn't penetrate their frontal armor except at suicidally close ranges. He shook his head. We lost a lot of good men learning that lesson. Caldwell nodded. This much was well-documented history. The British and Americans had different ideas about solving the problem, Thompson continued. The Brits went all in on firepower. They shoehorned their 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the Sherman turret. One hell of a gun, could punch through a Tiger's armor at respectable distances, but it was like putting a howitzer in a closet. Cramped the turret something fierce, made loading difficult, threw the balance off. The Firefly, Caldwell said. That's right. Meanwhile, our boys took a more balanced approach with the Easy-8, improved suspension, wider tracks for better mobility, and the 76mm gun. Not as powerful as the 17-pounder, but a significant improvement over the 75mm, and it didn't compromise the tank's handling or the crew's effectiveness. Thompson paused, his expression turning more serious. But the real story of Thunderbolt Duel wasn't about the tanks themselves. It was about the politics, the pressure, and what your father was really asked to do. Caldwell felt a chill of anticipation, which was what exactly? Officially, Lieutenant Jack Caldwell was to conduct an objective assessment of both Sherman variants and recommend which should receive priority in production and deployment. Thompson's voice lowered. Unofficially, there was tremendous pressure from both American and British commands. Each wanted their solution to win out. For reasons of national pride? Partly that, but also production contracts, strategic influence, you name it. Thompson shook his head. Your father was caught in the middle, a lieutenant making decisions that generals and politicians were invested in. Caldwell tried to imagine his father, a young man not much older than many of the soldiers Caldwell himself had commanded, bearing that kind of responsibility. There's more, Thompson said, lowering his voice further. Thunderbolt Duel wasn't just a comparative test. It was preparation for something specific, something big. What do you mean? The High Command needed to know exactly which variant would be most effective against the elite German armored units they expected to face in the final push. They needed practical information, not just range tests and penetration tables. Thompson glanced around the room, the old habit of secrecy still strong after all these decades. Your father was given the real mission. Determine which tank would give our boys the best chance of survival against the remaining Panthers and Tigers. Not which one looked better on paper or satisfied some general's ego, but which one would bring more of our men home alive. Caldwell felt his throat tighten. This was the father he had always imagined but never knew, a man who understood that behind every technical specification and tactical decision were the lives of young men in steel coffins. It was an impossible position, Thompson continued. If he recommended the Firefly, the Americans would feel betrayed. If he recommended the Easy-8, the British would accuse him of favoritism. And all the while, men were dying in inferior tanks while the brass debated. What did he do? Caldwell asked quietly. Thompson smiled slightly. That's what you need to discover for yourself, Colonel. I can tell you what I saw, but to really understand your father's decision, you need to follow his journey. He reached into a pocket of his shirt and pulled out a faded envelope. I've kept this all these years, never opened it. Your father gave it to me just before we shipped out on the last mission. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure his family got it someday. He extended the envelope toward Caldwell. Nothing did happen to him, at least not then, We all made it back. When I tried to return it, he told me to keep it anyway. Said someday it might be needed to tell the true story. Caldwell accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. His name was written on the front in his father's familiar handwriting. He knew you'd be the one to find all this eventually, Thompson said softly. Jack always played the long game. The transatlantic flight gave Caldwell ample time to read through the documents he'd copied from the museum archives and to study his father's journal. The technical details were fascinating from a professional perspective. Precise measurements of armor penetration at various ranges, mobility tests across different terrains, ammunition expenditure rates, and crew fatigue assessments. But it was the human elements that captivated him. His father's neat, precise handwriting recorded not just facts and figures, but observations about the men who crewed both tanks. Notes about how the cramped conditions in the Firefly affected crew coordination during extended operations. Observations on how the smoother ride of the Easy 8 reduced gunner fatigue and improved accuracy. One entry particularly stood out. Watched British crew load and fire 17-pounder 20 consecutive times today. By the 15th round, loader was showing significant fatigue. Final 5 rounds averaged 8.7 seconds between shots, nearly double the initial rate. In actual combat, that delay could prove fatal. The Easy 8 crew maintained more consistent times throughout the same test. Technical superiority means nothing if human limitations negated in the field. That pragmatic appreciation for the human element of warfare was something Caldwell recognized from his own command experience. The best equipment in the world was only as effective as the men operating it. He had not yet opened Thompson's envelope. Something told him it should wait until he had more pieces of the puzzle. London greeted Caldwell with gray skies and a persistent drizzle that seemed fitting for his mission of historical excavation. Margaret Wilson had suggested they meet at the Imperial War Museum, where her father's papers had been donated years earlier. She was waiting for him in the museum cafe, a tall, elegant woman with silver hair and the straight-back posture that Caldwell recognized as the carriage of someone raised in a military household. She rose as he approached, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Colonel Caldwell, you have your father's eyes, you know." "So I've been told," he replied, shaking her hand. "Thank you for meeting with me, Miss Wilson." "Margaret, please, and I should be thanking you." She gestured for him to sit. "When you contacted me about Thunderbolt Duel, I could hardly believe it. Father spoke of your father often, but I never knew the full extent of their work together." A waiter appeared and they ordered tea. Once he had gone, Margaret continued, "I brought some things I thought might interest you." She opened a leather portfolio and removed several photographs. "These were my father's personal photos from the project." Caldwell examined the images. 2 Sherman tanks positioned side by side in a muddy field. British and American crews standing together beside their vehicles. Officers hunched over maps spread on the hood of a Jeep. In several photos, he recognized his father, young, serious, often in conversation with a tall British officer whom Caldwell assumed was Colonel Wilson. "They were an odd pair," Margaret said, watching him study the photographs. "My father was Cambridge educated, 15 years older, from an established military family. Your father was younger, from a working-class background in Pennsylvania, as I recall. But father always said Lieutenant Caldwell was the finest officer he'd ever worked with, regardless of nationality or rank." "Did your father ever discuss the nature of their work?" Caldwell asked. Margaret sipped her tea before answering. "Only in general terms. He said they were evaluating tank designs, but that it was more complicated than a simple technical assessment. There were political dimensions." She lowered her voice slightly. "Father once said, after too many brandies on Remembrance Day, that your father had more moral courage than all the generals combined." "Moral courage?" He never elaborated. Margaret reached into her portfolio again. "But perhaps these might shed some light. Father kept a private correspondence with Lieutenant Caldwell after the war. Not many letters, just 1 or 2 a year, but they continued until Father's death in 1978. She handed Caldwell a small bundle of envelopes tied with faded ribbon. "I've never read them. They seemed too personal, but when you contacted me about Thunderbolt Duel, I thought perhaps they were meant for you now." Caldwell accepted the letters with a sense of reverence. "Thank you. This means more than I can express." "There's one more thing," Margaret said, her expression growing more serious. "Father had a private safe in his study. After he died, I found a sealed envelope inside marked Thunderbolt Duel Classified. Inside was a single document, what appeared to be a draft of a final report, with notes in both your father's and my father's handwriting. She withdrew a plastic sleeve containing several yellowed pages. The official report in the military archives is quite different from this draft. I've always wondered why. Caldwell examined this document, noting the substantial differences between this draft and the official report he had read in the museum archives. The draft was far more candid about the strengths and weaknesses of both tank variants and included specific tactical recommendations that were absent from the final version. This suggests they were pressured to modify their conclusions, Caldwell said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Yes, that was Father's implication, though he never stated it directly. Margaret studied Caldwell's face. Colonel, may I ask what you intend to do with this information? After all these years, does it really matter which tank was judged superior? Caldwell considered her question carefully. It's not about the tanks, not really. It's about understanding what my father faced, the decisions he made and why he never spoke of them. And perhaps he hesitated. Perhaps there's a lesson here that's still relevant, about how we equip our soldiers, about the intersection of technology, politics, and the human element in warfare. Margaret nodded slowly. Father would have appreciated that perspective. He always said the true story of Thunderbolt Duel was worth telling, if only the right person came along to tell it. She glanced at her watch. The museum's archives will be open for another 3 hours. I've arranged for you to have access to my father's personal papers. There may be more information there. As they rose to leave the cafe, Margaret placed a hand on Caldwell's arm. One thing Father did tell me, your father was asked to make an impossible choice, and he found a third way. That decision saved countless lives. In the museum's climate-controlled archive room, Caldwell lost himself in Colonel Wilson's meticulous records. The British officer had documented everything: weather conditions during testing, crew rotations, ammunition expenditures, maintenance requirements. But most valuable were his personal observations about the American lieutenant who had been his counterpart. Lieutenant Caldwell continues to impress, one entry read. Despite pressure from his superiors to favor the American design, he remains stubbornly objective. Today he criticized the Easy-8's inferior penetration capabilities in a report that will surely earn him no friends at headquarters. The man appears immune to political considerations when lives are at stake. Another entry, dated later. Disturbing news from Lieutenant Caldwell. General Armstrong visited yesterday and made it quite clear that a recommendation favoring the Firefly would be viewed as unpatriotic and potentially harmful to the lieutenant's career. I admire the young man's resolve in the face of such blatant intimidation. Caldwell felt a growing admiration for the father he had never truly known, a young officer standing firm against pressure from above, committed to finding the truth regardless of political consequences. But it was an entry from October 1904 that truly caught his attention. Unexpected encounter with enemy armor during routine testing near the front. 1 Tiger Moai and 2 Panzer IVs engaged our position. Both Firefly and Easy-8 performed in combat conditions. Lieutenant Caldwell's actions during the engagement were nothing short of extraordinary. His tactical deployment of both tanks demonstrated a profound understanding of their respective strengths and limitations. The experience has fundamentally altered my thinking about our final recommendations. Caldwell searched for more details about this encounter but found none in the official records. It seemed the unexpected combat engagement that had been omitted from the formal documentation, perhaps because unauthorized combat testing would have raised questions from higher command. As the archive's closing time approached, Caldwell gathered his notes and copies of the most relevant documents. He had learned much, but still felt he was missing the crucial piece that would explain his father's ultimate decision and why it had remained classified for so many decades. Back in his hotel room, Caldwell spread the materials across the bed: the official archives, Frank Thompson's recollections, Margaret Wilson's father's private notes, and his own father's journal. Like pieces of a complex puzzle, they began to form a picture, but with a critical section still missing. It was time to open the envelope Thompson had given him. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper in his father's handwriting, dated October 28, 1944. To my son, if you're reading this, you've discovered Thunderbolt Duel and are seeking answers. I always knew this day might come. You were always too much like me to leave a mystery unexplored. I won't burden you with the technical details. You'll have found those in the official records. What won't be in those records is the truth about what we were really testing. The High Command and was planning the final push into Germany, Operation Plunder and the crossing of the Rhine. They anticipated facing the last of Germany's elite armored units, including remaining Tiger and Panther battalions. The debate between the Firefly and Easy-8 had become more than a technical question. It had become a matter of national prestige and industrial contracts. I was ordered to recommend either the British or American design for mass production and deployment. Either choice would have been wrong. The Firefly's superior firepower came at the cost of crew efficiency and tactical flexibility. The Easy-8's balanced performance lacked the raw, penetrating power needed against the heaviest German armor. Neither represented the complete answer we needed. What we discovered through Blood and Fire, was that the true solution lay not in choosing one over the other, but in how they were used together. The Firefly excelled as a long-range hunter, able to engage and destroy heavy German armor before it closed to effective range. The Easy-8's superior mobility and crew efficiency made it the ideal platform for exploitation and flanking maneuvers. I submitted a report recommending an integrated deployment strategy, Fireflies positioned as overwatching fire support, with Easy-8's maneuvering to engage from the flanks. This approach was rejected initially as logistically complicated and contradictory to established doctrine. It took an unauthorized field test, a desperate engagement against a Tiger company near the Belgian border, to prove the concept. We destroyed 5 German tanks without losing a single Sherman by employing both variants according to their strengths. The final classified report recommended exactly this approach, though for political reasons, both the Americans and British publicly maintained that their design was superior. I've never spoken of this because the lessons seemed too dangerous. Sometimes the established doctrine is wrong, and sometimes those in command value prestige over effectiveness. These are not comfortable truths for a military organization. But they are truths you may need to know if you follow the path I suspect you will. Whatever battles you face, remember, the perfect solution rarely exists. The best answer often lies in understanding the strengths of imperfect options and combining them in ways others haven't considered. With pride, your father, Caldwell read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. In his mind's eye, he could see his father, not the distant, reserved man he had known, but the young lieutenant making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. For the first time, he understood why his father had never discussed his wartime experiences. It wasn't just the trauma of combat or the modesty of his generation. Jack Caldwell had learned a lesson about military leadership that was both powerful and potentially subversive. That doctrine and politics sometimes needed to be set aside in favor of pragmatic solutions that saved lives. It was a lesson that Caldwell himself had encountered in his own career, though never under such dramatic circumstances. The tension between following established procedures and adapting to battlefield realities was eternal. Caldwell carefully returned the letter to its envelope and placed it with his father's journal. Tomorrow he would return to America with a story worth telling, not just about 2 variants of the Sherman tank, but about a young officer who found a third way when presented with an impossible choice. As he prepared for bed, Caldwell's thoughts turned to the tanks themselves. The Firefly, with its massive 17-pounder gun that could destroy a Tiger at over 1,000 yards. The Easy-8 with its improved suspension, wider tracks, and more balanced performance. Neither perfect, but devastating when used in concert. His father had understood what many military planners forgot, that weapons were tools wielded by human beings with all their strengths and limitations. The best military solution was rarely about the superior technical specification, but about how technology interfaced with human capabilities and limitations. It was a lesson as relevant in the age of digital battlefields and precision-guided munitions as it had been when men fought inside steel boxes with manually loaded guns. Caldwell drifted towards sleep with a new connection to his father, a shared understanding that transcended time and technology. In the morning, he would begin the work of telling the true story of Thunderbolt Duel, not just as a historical footnote about tank design, but as an enduring lesson about leadership, courage, and the human dimension of warfare. In his dreams, he saw 2 Sherman tanks advancing across a muddy European field, one with a long, powerful gun, the other with wider tracks and smoother movement. Between them walked a young lieutenant, guiding them forward toward distant thunder. And for once, the face of that lieutenant was clear and familiar, a face Caldwell recognized from photographs, from memories, and from his own reflection. Morning sunlight gleamed off the polished marble of the National Army Museum as Colonel Robert Caldwell climbed the broad steps, clutching a leather portfolio containing the treasures he had gathered during his journey. The security guard at the entrance nodded with recognition as Caldwell passed, now a familiar face after his days of research. In the climate-controlled research room, Dr. Hughes waited with a fresh box of archives. Her eyes brightened at the sight of Caldwell. "Colonel, you look like a man who's found what he was searching for." Caldwell placed his portfolio on the table. "Some of it, but there's more to uncover." He gestured to the new box. "What have you found?" "Technical testing records," she replied, opening the box. "Ammunition expenditure reports, armor penetration tests, mobility trials, the complete datasets from the Thunderbolt Duel assessments." Caldwell removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "Perfect. I need to understand exactly what my father was seeing in those tests." Dr. Hughes hesitated. "There's something else you should know. I've been contacted by the Pentagon. Apparently word has gotten around about your research. They're interested in your findings." "The Pentagon? After all these years?" "The comparative assessment of different tank design philosophies remains relevant, especially with ongoing debates about armor versus mobility in modern vehicles." She lowered her voice. "There's also some sensitivity about the historical tensions between American and British military approaches." Caldwell nodded, understanding the subtext. Even after decades, institutional pride and national defense narratives remain powerful forces. "Tell them I'm conducting personal research regarding my father's service," he said. "Nothing more." He turned his attention to the box, pulling out the first folder labeled 17-pounder performance analysis. Inside were detailed firing tables, penetration calculations, and observer reports. One document immediately caught his attention: a test firing report dated September 12, 1944. It described the first time his father had witnessed the Firefly in action. The report was clinical in its language, but Caldwell could read between the lines, imagining the scene as if he had been there himself. Lieutenant Jack Caldwell stood behind the British Firefly crew, his body tense with anticipation. Before them, across 800 yards of cleared testing ground, sat the hulking shell of a captured German Tiger tank. Its engine and internal mechanisms had been removed, but its formidable armor remained intact, a perfect target to evaluate the Firefly's much-vaunted penetration capabilities. "Ready when you are, Lieutenant," said Sergeant James Cooper, the British gunner, his eye already pressed to the sight. Jack consulted his stopwatch. "Fire when ready, Sergeant." Cooper drew a steady breath, made a minute adjustment to his aim, and squeezed the trigger. The 17-pounder cannon roared, the massive recoil rocking the entire Sherman chassis. A fraction of a second later, the armor-piercing round struck the Tiger's frontal glacis with a shower of sparks and a metallic shriek that echoed across the testing ground. Through his binoculars, Jack could see the result immediately: a clean penetration through the Tiger's upper front plate, an area that had proven nearly impervious to the standard 75mm Sherman gun. "Target penetrated," reported Captain Wilson, who observed from a forward position. "Clean through the upper glacis at a 30-degree angle. I'd call that a kill shot." A murmur of appreciation passed through the assembled observers. The British crew exchanged satisfied glances. "Bloody remarkable," said Colonel Wilson, the British commander, standing beside Jack. "At 800 yards, no less. Your standard 75 couldn't manage that at point-blank range." Jack nodded, recording the data in his notebook. "Impressive penetration. Let's see how quickly they can follow up with a second shot." He started his stopwatch again as the Firefly crew scrambled to reload. The confines of the turret, cramped even in a standard Sherman, were especially tight in the Firefly. The massive breech of the 17-pounder took up space normally used by the loader, forcing him into an awkward position. "Time to second shot, 8.4 seconds, Jack noted as the cannon fired again. Another successful penetration. 8.4 seconds between shots, Colonel Wilson mused. Not bad considering the size of that shell, though I suspect it would be longer in combat conditions with the vehicle moving and under fire. "Agreed," Jack said. "Let's run the full firing sequence test and see how the load times hold up over multiple rounds." The demonstration continued, with the Firefly firing 20 consecutive rounds at various points on the Tiger's armor. Jack observed with professional detachment, but inside he felt a growing sense of both hope and concern. The Firefly's penetration power was undeniable, a game-changer against German heavy tanks. But with each reload, he noted the increasing strain on the loader, the cramped conditions taking their toll as the test progressed. By the 15th round, the loader was visibly struggling, sweat pouring down his face as he wrestled the heavy shells into position. The time between shots had nearly doubled. In real combat, Jack noted in his journal later that evening, those extra seconds could mean the difference between victory and death. The 17-pounder is a magnificent weapon, but its integration into the Sherman creates significant crew efficiency issues that cannot be overlooked. Caldwell looked up from the report, his mind filled with images of the scene. His father had approached the evaluation with methodical thoroughness, considering not just the raw penetration power, but the human element as well, how the design affected the crew's ability to function under stress. He turned to the next folder, HVSS Mobility Trials. This contained the testing data for the EZ-8's improved horizontal volute spring suspension system in wider tracks. Again, he found himself transported back to autumn 1940. Rain had fallen steadily for 3 days, turning the test course into a quagmire of deep mud and standing water. Perfect conditions, Lieutenant Jack Caldwell thought, for evaluating the EZ-8's improved mobility. He stood on a small rise overlooking the course, rain dripping from his helmet as he watched the 2 Sherman tanks approach the starting line. To the left, a standard M4A3 Sherman with the original vertical volute spring suspension. To the right, the new M4A3E8 EZ-8 with its horizontal suspension system and wider tracks. "Course is set, Lieutenant," reported Sergeant Reynolds, soaked to the skin but seemingly unbothered by the downpour. "Half-mile circuit, including the ridge climb, the ditch crossing, and the mud pit." Jack nodded. "Have both tanks make 2 complete circuits. I want comparative times and driver observations afterward." He raised his hand, then dropped it sharply. Both tanks lurched forward, their engines roaring as they attacked the course. The differences were immediately apparent. The standard Sherman began to struggle as soon as it hit the first mud section, its narrower tracks sinking deep, the tank slewing sideways as the driver fought for control. In contrast, the EZ-8 moved with noticeable confidence, its weight distributed more evenly by the wider tracks and improved suspension. At the ridge climb, a steep 30-degree slope now slick with mud, the standard Sherman made 3 attempts before finally crawling over the crest, its tracks spinning furiously and throwing mud in high arcs. The EZ-8 took the same slope in a single smooth ascent. But the most dramatic difference came at the water-filled ditch crossing. The standard Sherman hit the far bank with a bone-jarring impact that nearly threw Jack off his feet even from his observation position. He could only imagine what the crew inside experienced. When the EZ-8 crossed the same obstacle, the horizontal suspension absorbed much of the impact, the tank settling quickly without the pronounced oscillation exhibited by the standard model. Both tanks completed the course, but the results were clear. The EZ-8 finished its 2 circuits 3 minutes faster and with visibly less strain on both vehicle and crew. Later, Jack interviewed both tank commanders. "Like driving a bucking bronco," said Sergeant Miller of the standard Sherman. "Every impact goes right up your spine. After an hour, your teeth are rattling in your head, and accurate gunnery becomes almost impossible." In contrast, Staff Sergeant Davis of the EZ-8 reported, "Smoothest Sherman I've ever driven. The improved suspension makes a world of difference. You can actually maintain speed over rough ground without shaking the crew to pieces. And the wider tracks give you confidence in mud that you just don't have with the standard model." Jack made careful notes, adding his own observation. The E8's mobility improvements are not merely about speed, but about crew endurance and combat effectiveness. A tank that can move more efficiently while maintaining crew comfort will arrive at the battlefield with gunners whose hands aren't shaking from exhaustion, a factor that no penetration table or speed test can quantify. Caldwell nodded to himself as he finished reading the mobility trial reports. His father had understood something fundamental about armored warfare, that raw specifications never told the complete story. The human element, how equipment affected the men who operated it under combat conditions, was equally important. He reached for another folder, this one labeled Crew Efficiency Comparisons. Inside were detailed time studies of every aspect of tank operations, from target acquisition to firing to communications efficiency. One report particularly caught his attention: Turret Environment Assessment. Lieutenant Jack Caldwell climbed down through the commander's hatch of the Firefly, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the cool autumn air. He had just spent 4 hours inside the tank during a simulated combat exercise, experiencing firsthand the environment that crews would face in actual operations. Captain Wilson waited beside the tank, clipboard in hand. "Well, Lieutenant, your impressions?" Jack took a long drink from his canteen before answering. The 17-pounder dominates the fighting compartment. The loader has to work around the massive breach, which slows reload times and increases fatigue. The gunner's position is compromised by the modified layout, affecting target acquisition time. He wipes sweat from his forehead. Most concerning is the communication difficulty. With the radio relocated to the rear of the turret, the commander has to shout to be heard over the engine and gun. In combat, that could lead to critical delays or misunderstood orders. Captain Wilson nodded, making notes. Similar to our observations. The Firefly is essentially a gun platform first, tank second. The crew adapts to the weapon rather than the weapon being optimized for the crew. "I'll need to experience the EZ-8 under similar conditions for comparison," Jack said. 4 hours of simulated combat operations, same scenario. The next day, Jack emerged from the EZ-8 after completing the identical exercise. The difference in his physical state was immediately apparent. Less fatigue, less strain. "The standard Sherman turret layout is preserved," he reported to Captain Wilson. "Crew positions remain optimal. The 76mm gun, while not as powerful as the 17-pounder, is better integrated into the design. Communication is clearer, reload times more consistent." He consulted his notes. Target acquisition averaged 3.2 seconds faster in the EZ-8. Reload times remained consistent throughout the exercise, while they degraded by nearly 40% in the Firefly after the 2-hour mark. "So the crew fights more efficiently," Captain Wilson summarized. "Precisely. The question becomes, is the Firefly's superior penetration power worth the reduction in crew efficiency? In a short engagement against a single target, the Firefly has the advantage. In a sustained action against multiple targets," Jack let the implication hang. "The efficiency gap would widen," Wilson finished. "The EZ-8 crew would maintain effectiveness longer." "That's my assessment," Jack agreed. "But these are controlled conditions. We need data from actual combat situations." Wilson's expression grew serious. "That might be arranged sooner than you think, Lieutenant." Caldwell felt a chill as he read that last exchange. The implications were clear. His father and the Thunderbolt Duel team had moved beyond controlled tests into actual combat evaluations, something that would have required special authorization given the experimental nature of their work. He searched through the remaining folders, looking for combat reports, but found nothing official. This confirmed Frank Thompson's claim that the most crucial test had been kept off the books, an unauthorized combat evaluation that had shaped the final recommendations. Dr. Hughes appeared to decide. "Finding what you need, Colonel?" "Parts of it," Caldwell replied. "But there's a gap in the record. The technical evaluations are comprehensive, but there should be combat assessment reports as well." "Combat reports?" Dr. Hughes frowned. "The Thunderbolt Duel was a testing program, not a combat unit. I have reason to believe they conducted actual combat evaluations, possibly unauthorized." Dr. Hughes considered this. There might be another source. Personal after-action reports sometimes contained information that didn't make it into the official record. They would have been classified separately. She disappeared into the archives and returned 20 minutes later with a thin folder. "This was filed under your father's service record, not with the Thunderbolt Duel materials. It might be what you're looking for." Caldwell opened the folder to find a handwritten report. The paper yellowed with age. At the top was written, "Personal observations following encounter with enemy armor, October 17, 1944. Not for official distribution." He began to read, once again transported to the autumn of 1944. The morning had dawned cold and foggy in the Ardennes forest. Lieutenant Jack Caldwell's small convoy, 2 jeeps, the Firefly and the EZ-8, had set out at first light, planning to conduct mobility tests in the heavily wooded terrain near the front lines. It wasn't technically a combat mission. They were supposed to remain well behind the forward positions. But Jack had argued successfully that they needed to test the tanks under conditions similar to actual combat environments. Colonel Wilson rode in the lead jeep with Jack, while the 2 Sherman variants followed with their crews. Captain Parker, the American liaison officer assigned to observe their activities, though Jack suspected his real purpose was to ensure the American tank received fair treatment, brought up the rear in the second jeep. "Visibility is poor," Colonel Wilson commented as they navigated a narrow forest road, the fog swirling around them. Perhaps we should postpone until conditions improve. This is exactly the kind of condition these tanks will face in combat, Jack replied. Better to know their limitations now than discover them under fire. Wilson nodded, conceding the point. Very well, Lieutenant, but let's maintain our distance from the forward positions as ordered. They continued another kilometer before finding a suitable testing area, a section of forest with varied terrain including a small stream, steep embankments, and dense woods that would challenge the tank's maneuverability. Jack had just finished briefing the tank commanders on the day's testing protocol when the distant sound of gunfire reached them. That's not our artillery, Captain Parker said, suddenly alert. German 88s, Colonel Wilson agreed, his experienced ear recognizing the distinctive report of the German guns. But they should be miles from here. Jack pulled out his map. Unless the line has moved, we received our intelligence yesterday morning. The radio in Wilson's Jeep crackled to life. All units, be advised. German armored breakthrough in Sector 7. Elements of 2nd Panzer Division advancing along Forest Road Baker 3. All non-combat units evacuate immediately. Jack studied the map, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. Forest Road Baker 3, that's less than a kilometer east of our position. As if to confirm his assessment, the distinctive sound of tank treads grinding over forest debris reached them, followed by the low rumble of powerful engines. German armor, Wilson said quietly, moving this way. Jack made a rapid decision. We need to withdraw immediately, but we also need to know what we're facing. He turned to the tank commanders. Sergeant Cooper, take the Firefly to that ridgeline. Observation position only. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Sergeant Davis, position the Easy 8 by the stream crossing as a blocking force if we need to retreat. Captain Parker, radio headquarters and inform them of our situation. The men moved with professional efficiency, the tanks rumbling into their assigned positions. Jack and Colonel Wilson took the lead jeep to a vantage point that offered visibility through the thinning fog. What they saw sent a chill through Jack's blood. Moving steadily along the forest road was a German armored column, a Tiger I tank leading, followed by 2 Panzer IVs and an armored personnel carrier. Reconnaissance in force, Wilson murmured, probing for weak points in our line. And they're about to find us, Jack replied grimly. We need to withdraw before they spot us. But fate intervened in the form of an overeager German tank commander. The Tiger suddenly accelerated, pulling ahead of its companions as it rounded a bend in the road, bringing it into direct line of sight with the Firefly on the ridgeline. For a moment, both tanks seemed frozen in mutual surprise. Then training took over. The Firefly fired first, the massive 17-pounder cannon roaring in the forest quiet. Jack watched through binoculars as the armor-piercing round struck the Tiger's frontal armor at a slight angle. It penetrated, but not deeply enough for an immediate kill. The wounded Tiger slewed sideways, its turret rotating to bring its deadly 88mm gun to bear on the Firefly. Cooper, back down the ridge now, Jack shouted into the radio. The Firefly began to reverse, but not before the Tiger fired. The German shell missed narrowly, exploding in the trees behind the Firefly and showering it with splinters and debris. Now the forest erupted with activity. The 2 Panzer IVs advanced to support the Tiger, while the German infantry carrier disgorged a squad of troops who began to deploy into the woods. We're outnumbered and outgunned, Wilson stated calmly. Conventional wisdom says we should retreat immediately. Jack studied the situation, his mind racing through options. Conventional wisdom assumes conventional tanks, he replied. We have something different. He keyed the radio. Cooper, keep the Firefly on the reverse slope of the ridge. You have superior range with the 17-pounder. I want you to engage the Tiger if it crests the ridge, but do not expose yourself to the Panzer IVs. Understood, Lieutenant, came Cooper's steady reply. Davis, bring the Easy 8 along the stream bed. Use the superior mobility to circle wide around their right flank. The water will mask your engine noise. When you reach the fallen tree, you should have a clear shot at the side armor of the Tiger. Moving now, sir, Davis acknowledged. To Wilson and Parker, Jack explained. The Firefly has the penetrating power to take on the Tiger head-on, but limited maneuverability in this terrain. The Easy 8 can't penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor reliably, but it can outmaneuver it and strike from the flank. Wilson nodded appreciatively, using each to its strength. Risky, but clever. The next 10 minutes unfolded with the tense precision of a chess match. The Tiger cautiously advanced toward the ridge where the Firefly waited, while the Panzer IVs spread out to provide covering fire. Meanwhile, the EZ-8 slipped silently along the stream bed, the sound of its movement masked by the sporadic fire now being exchanged between the German infantry and Captain Parker, who had positioned himself with a Browning automatic rifle to provide covering fire. When the Tiger reached the base of the ridge, the Firefly fired again from its hull-down position, only the turret exposed. The 17-pounder shell struck the Tiger's turret ring, not penetrating completely but jamming the turret mechanism. The German commander, now unable to traverse his gun, began to back the Tiger away, presenting its side armor to the position where the EZ-8 had emerged from the stream bed. Davis didn't waste the opportunity. The EZ-8 fired 3 rapid shots, the 76mm shells striking the Tiger's thinner side armor in quick succession. The third round found a vulnerable point, and the German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. But the engagement wasn't over. The 2 Panzer IVs now focused their attention on the EZ-8's position, both firing almost simultaneously. One shell missed entirely, but the other struck the EZ-8's frontal armor, fortunately at an angle that caused it to ricochet without penetrating. Davis, pull back to cover. Cooper, can you engage the Panzer IVs from your position? Jack called into the radio. Affirmative. I have line of sight on the leftmost Panzer. Take the shot. The Firefly's 17-pounder roared again, the shell easily penetrating the Panzer IV's frontal armor. The German tank slewed to a stop, its ammunition cooking off in a series of internal explosions that blew the turret completely off. The remaining Panzer IV, now realizing it faced superior firepower, began a fighting withdrawal, laying down smoke to cover the retreat of the infantry squad. Within minutes, the forest fell silent again, except for the crackling of flames from the destroyed German tanks. Jack surveyed the scene from the ridge, scarcely believing what had just occurred. A scratch force consisting of 2 experimental Sherman variants had just defeated a German armored probe that, by all conventional assessments, should have overwhelmed them. Colonel Wilson joined him on the ridge, his expression thoughtful. That was most instructive, Lieutenant. Not at all the test we had planned, but perhaps the one we needed. Jack nodded, already processing the tactical lessons of the engagement. The Firefly's penetration power proved decisive against frontal armor, while the EZ-8's mobility allowed it to achieve a favorable firing position. Neither could have succeeded alone against that force. Indeed, Wilson lit his pipe, seemingly unconcerned by the possibility of lingering German forces. It suggests that the question we've been asked, which tank is superior, might be fundamentally flawed. The wrong question entirely, Jack agreed. They're complementary systems, not competitors. The real question is how to employ them together for maximum effectiveness. Captain Parker approached, his uniform smudged with dirt from the firefight, but his expression animated. Gentlemen, I've just received word from headquarters. The German probe has been repelled all along the line. Our little action here apparently discouraged any further advance in this sector. He looked at the smoking remains of the Tiger and Panzer IV. They're calling it a significant tactical victory. Significant indeed, Wilson said, exchanging a knowing look with Jack, though perhaps not in the way headquarters imagines. Later that night, as Jack recorded the day's events in his personal journal, he wrote, "Today's unplanned engagement provided clarity that no controlled test could have offered. The Firefly and EZ-8 represent different but complementary approaches to the same problem. The Firefly's superior firepower makes it the ideal tank killer, capable of engaging heavy German armor from safe distances. The EZ-8's balanced performance allows it to maneuver more effectively, exploit weaknesses, and maintain crew efficiency in extended operations. The solution is not to choose one over the other, but to employ them in concert, each according to its strengths. This insight runs counter to the current manufacturing and deployment strategy, which seeks standardization above all. It will not be a popular conclusion with those who have already committed to one approach or the other. But it is the truth as I have witnessed it, and it is a truth that might save lives." Caldwell set down the report, profoundly moved by his father's clarity of thought, even in the chaos of unexpected combat. Jack Caldwell had seen beyond the immediate technical comparison to grasp a fundamental truth about combat effectiveness, that complementary systems used in concert often outperformed any single superior platform. It was a lesson that still resonated in modern armored warfare, where combined arms doctrine emphasized the integration of different capabilities rather than reliance on a single wonder weapon. But Caldwell also understood why such a conclusion would have been controversial in 1944. Both American and British military hierarchies were deeply invested in their respective approaches. Manufacturing lines were being tooled for mass production. Training programs were being standardized. The idea that the optimal solution involved maintaining two different variants with different tactical employments would have complicated logistics, training, and deployment. All cardinal sins in the eyes of wartime planners focused on standardization and simplification. Dr. Hughes returned to the research room, her expression concerned. "Colonel, there's a gentleman here asking to see you. He says he's from the Department of Defense Historical Review Division, but his credentials suggest he's actually from Defense Intelligence." Caldwell looked up, not entirely surprised. "Did he give a name?" "Colonel Richard Bennett. He says it's regarding your research into Thunderbolt Duel." The name struck Caldwell with unexpected force. Bennett. The same surname as the officer whom Frank Thompson had mentioned, the one who had allegedly leaked information to the press in an attempt to influence the outcome of the Thunderbolt Duel assessment. "Send him in," Caldwell said, quickly organizing the documents he had been reviewing. Colonel Richard Bennett entered the research room with the confident stride of a career military officer. In his early 60s, he had the trim build and watchful eyes of someone who had spent more time behind a desk than in the field. His immaculately pressed uniform bore the insignia of the Defense Intelligence Agency. "Colonel Caldwell," Bennett extended his hand. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." Caldwell shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip. "I wasn't aware I had a choice, Colonel Bennett." Bennett smiled thinly. "Always the direct approach from the Tank Corps. Please, I'm not here to interfere with your research. Quite the contrary." "Then why are you here?" Bennett glanced at the documents spread across the table. "I see you've been busy. Found anything interesting about your father's work on the Sherman variants?" "Quite a bit," Caldwell replied cautiously, "though there seem to be some gaps in the official record." "There would be," Bennett nodded. "Some aspects of the Thunderbolt Duel project remained highly classified, even after the general declassification, such as the unauthorized combat evaluation near the Ardennes." Bennett's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've been thorough." He pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. "I should explain my interest. Major Richard Bennett Sr. was my father. He served as the American liaison officer to the Thunderbolt Duel project." Caldwell felt a jolt of recognition. "Captain Parker from my father's report. His cover name for the unofficial records, yes. My father's actual role was more complex than simple observation. He was there to ensure that American interests were properly represented." "You mean he was there to ensure the EZ-8 received favorable consideration?" Caldwell said bluntly. Bennett didn't deny it. The stakes were high, billions in manufacturing contracts, not to mention national prestige. The British were equally determined to see the Firefly adopted as the standard. "And when it looked like my father might recommend a dual deployment strategy instead of picking a winner." "Your father's approach threatened powerful interests on both sides," Bennett confirmed, "which is why certain elements of the project remained classified for so long. The lessons learned ran counter to the prevailing military-industrial mindset." Caldwell studied Bennett carefully. "You still haven't told me why you're here." Bennett reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed folder with top-secret markings, now crossed out with a declassified stamp. "Because the full story of Thunderbolt Duel may finally be ready to be told. These are the final classified elements of the project. My father's personal records, which he turned over to Defense Intelligence before his death." He slid the folder across the table. "You should know that your father's insights eventually prevailed, though not in time for wide implementation during the war. The concept of complementary armored systems operating in tactical concert became a cornerstone of post-war doctrine. Your father was simply too far ahead of his time." Caldwell accepted this folder with a sense of both eagerness and trepidation. "Why give this to me now?" "Because the questions your father was addressing, firepower versus mobility, specialization versus versatility, technical superiority versus human factors, remain relevant to modern armored warfare. His insights deserve to be part of the historical record." Bennett stood to leave. "And perhaps because I believe my father would have wanted your father's true contribution to be recognized." After Bennett departed, Caldwell opened the newly declassified folder. Inside were documents that filled the gaps in his understanding. Internal memoranda revealing the political pressures brought to bear on the Thunderbolt Duel project, intelligence assessments of German armored capabilities that had informed the urgency of the evaluation, and most valuably the complete record of communications between senior American and British commanders regarding Jack Caldwell's unconventional recommendations. One memo from General George Patton himself particularly stood out. Lieutenant Caldwell's assessment, while politically inconvenient, appears to be tactically sound. The complementary employment of specialized tank killers alongside more versatile platforms reflects my own experience with tank destroyer doctrine. I recommend we give his approach serious consideration despite the logistical complications it presents. Patton's support hadn't been enough to overcome institutional resistance to the dual deployment strategy in time for full implementation during the war. But as Bennett had indicated, the core insights had eventually been vindicated and incorporated into post-war armored doctrine. Caldwell sat back, processing all he had learned. His father had stood firm against enormous pressure, insisting on reporting what he had observed rather than what his superiors wished to hear. That moral courage had likely cost him career advancement, explaining his relatively modest rank at retirement. But it had also established principles that would eventually save countless lives in future conflicts. As the afternoon light began to fade, Caldwell carefully organized all the materials he had gathered: the technical evaluations, the combat reports, the political context, and most importantly, the human story behind it all. Tomorrow he would begin the work of crafting all of this into a coherent narrative that would finally bring the full story of Thunderbolt Duel to light. But tonight he would call his own son, a captain currently serving with an armored unit in Europe. They had much to discuss about the legacy of Lieutenant Jack Caldwell, a legacy of integrity, courage, and the profound understanding that in warfare, the human element ultimately matters more than technical specifications. As he packed away the last of the documents, Caldwell's hand lingered on the photograph of his father standing between the Firefly and the EZ-8. For the first time, he fully understood the thoughtful expression on the young lieutenant's face, the look of a man carrying the weight of lives that would be gained or lost based on his assessment. It was a burden Caldwell himself had carried during his own command days, that invisible weight of responsibility that only those who have borne it can truly recognize. "Well done, Dad," he whispered to the faded image. "Well done indeed." Dawn broke over the National Army Museum as Colonel Robert Caldwell climbed the stone steps for what he knew would be his final day of research. The security guard nodded with familiar recognition as Caldwell passed, now accustomed to the retired colonel's daily appearances. In the research room, Caldwell spread out the materials he had gathered over the past week, the full story of Thunderbolt Duel finally taking shape before him. The technical evaluations, combat reports, personal journals, and newly declassified political documents formed a mosaic that revealed not just the comparative merits of two Sherman variants, but a deeper story about courage, integrity, and the complex relationship between men and machines in the crucible of war. Dr. Hughes entered with a fresh cup of coffee, which she placed beside Caldwell's notes. "I thought you might need this. You've been at it since 5 this morning." Caldwell accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Last push. There's still one piece missing from this puzzle." "What's that?" "The final mission." Frank Thompson mentioned that after the combat encounter in the Ardennes, my father was given command of a mixed unit of Fireflies and EZ-8s for a special operation. Something significant enough that it influenced the final strategic recommendations for Sherman deployment. Dr. Hughes considered this. "I might know where to look." The operational records would have been classified separately from the technical evaluations. She disappeared into the archives, returning 30 minutes later with a sealed box marked Operation Anvil Strike, December 1944, classified. This was transferred from the operational archives when Thunderbolt Duel was declassified, but it remains sealed under a separate classification. Given everything else has been declassified, she broke the seal and opened the box. Inside were battle maps, operational orders, and after-action reports, all bearing Lieutenant Jack Caldwell's signature. "This is it," Caldwell said, carefully removing the documents. The final chapter. As he read through the operational orders, a clear picture began to emerge. Following the successful but unofficial engagement in the Ardennes, Jack Caldwell had been given temporary command of an experimental armored unit comprising 3 Firefly Shermans and 4 EZ-8 Shermans. Their mission? To support the Allied advance by neutralizing a German armored reserve that threatened to counterattack the American flank. The operation was designated Anvil Strike, a fitting name for what would prove to be the definitive test of Jack Caldwell's theories about complementary tank deployment. Caldwell began to read his father's detailed operational plan, imagining the scene as it had unfolded in December 1904. Lieutenant Jack Caldwell stood before the assembled tank commanders in the dimly lit barn, the winter wind howling outside as he pointed to the map spread across a makeshift table. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he traced the planned route of advance. Intelligence reports 3 Panthers and 2 Tigers in reserve here, behind this ridgeline, he explained, tapping a forested area on the map. They're positioned to counterattack our advance along this road, which is the only viable supply route for 3 divisions. If they cut it, our entire offensive stalls. Captain Wilson, now serving as Jack's executive officer for the operation, added, "Conventional wisdom would have us wait for air support to neutralize the threat, but the current weather makes that impossible. Command needs that armor eliminated within 24 hours. The assembled officers, 3 British Firefly commanders and 4 American EZ-8 commanders, studied the map with the focused attention of men whose lives would depend on understanding every detail. Our mission is straightforward but challenging, Jack continued. We will eliminate the German armored reserve before they can deploy against our supply lines. But our approach will be unconventional." He gestured to the British officers. "The Fireflies will establish overwatch positions here, here, and here," he said, marking 3 elevated positions with clear lines of fire to the German assembly area. "Your 17-pounders can engage the Tigers and Panthers from maximum range, beyond the effective range of their return fire." To the American officers, he explained, "The EZ-8s will approach from these 2 ravines using your superior mobility to maneuver to the enemy's flanks. You won't engage frontally unless absolutely necessary. Your role is to force the German armor to maneuver, exposing their side armor to the Fireflies." Sergeant Cooper, the senior British tank commander, frowned. "With respect, sir, you're asking us to split our force in the face of superior enemy armor. That violates every principle of armored warfare we've been taught. Every principle based on identical tanks with identical capabilities," Jack corrected. "We're not operating identical vehicles. We have complementary systems that, used properly, multiply our effectiveness beyond mere numbers." Captain Wilson stepped in. "Gentlemen, what Lieutenant Caldwell is proposing has been validated in combat, albeit on a smaller scale. The Firefly's penetration capability combined with the EZ-8's superior tactical mobility creates opportunities that neither tank could achieve alone. It's like a boxer using his jab to set up his power punch," added Staff Sergeant Davis, who had been part of the original Thunderbolt Duel team. "The EZ-8s keep them moving, the Fireflies deliver the knockout." Jack nodded appreciatively at the analogy. "Exactly, we fight as a single integrated force, not as individual tanks. Each type plays to its strengths while covering the other's vulnerabilities." He looked around the room, meeting each commander's eyes. "I know this approach contradicts your training. I know it feels risky, but I've seen it work. I believe in it. The question is, do you?" There was a moment of silence before Sergeant Cooper spoke again. "The Firefly can kill any tank the Germans have if we can get a clean shot. If your EZ-8s can give us those shots, we'll make them count." Staff Sergeant Miller, commanding one of the EZ-8s, nodded in agreement. "We can dance around those heavy bastards all day. Just don't ask us to go toe-to-toe with a Tiger." "That's precisely what I'm not asking you to do," Jack assured him. "Each to their strength. Together we'll hammer this German armor from angles they won't expect, using tactics they haven't trained against." By the time the briefing concluded, the skepticism had largely given way to cautious optimism. The plan was unorthodox but logical, playing to the specific capabilities of both Sherman variants rather than treating them as interchangeable units. As the commanders filed out to brief their crews, Captain Wilson remained behind with Jack. "It's a good plan," Wilson said quietly, "but you should know General Armstrong has taken a personal interest in this operation. He's made it clear that the outcome will directly influence the final Thunderbolt Duel recommendations." Jack sighed. "So the politics continue." "I'm afraid so. If we succeed using this integrated approach, it validates your recommendation for dual deployment. If we fail, then the standardization advocates win, and we settle on a single variant regardless of the tactical limitations." Jack folded the map carefully. "All the more reason to make this work." Wilson nodded. "Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow we'll test everything we've learned." The following morning dawned gray and cold, a light snow falling as the 7 Sherman tanks moved into position. Jack, commanding from the lead EZ-8, maintained radio discipline as they approached their designated staging areas. The Fireflies broke off first, climbing carefully to their overwatch positions on the surrounding hills. The Easy Eights continued forward, or using the terrain to mask their approach toward the German assembly area. Through his binoculars, Jack could see the German armor, 3 Panther tanks and 2 Tigers, just as intelligence had reported, positioned in a small clearing surrounded by forest. They were aligned in a defensive formation, clearly anticipating an attack along the main road rather than from the difficult terrain the Shermans were now traversing. "All units, report positions," Jack ordered quietly into his radio. The responses came back in sequence, each tank commander confirming they had reached their designated position. The Fireflies were in their overwatch positions, their 17-pounder guns ranged on the clearing. The Easy Eights were positioned along both ravines, ready to advance on Jack's command. "Remember the plan," Jack reminded them. "Fireflies engage from maximum range. Easy Eights maneuver to force enemy movement. Concentrate fire on one target at a time, beginning with the closest Tiger. Execute on my mark." Jack took a deep breath, surveying the battlefield one final time. Everything depended on coordination and timing. If the Fireflies revealed their positions too soon, the German tanks would target them before the Easy Eights could draw their attention. If the Easy Eights advanced too aggressively, they would face the superior German guns without the Fireflies supporting fire. "Operation Anvil Strike commences now," Jack ordered. "Firefly 1, engage the nearest Tiger." Sergeant Cooper's voice came back calm and professional. "Target acquired. Firing." The distant boom of the 17-pounder echoed across the valley, followed immediately by a bright flash as the armor-piercing round struck the Tiger's turret. It didn't penetrate completely, but the impact was severe enough to visibly rock the massive German tank. The German commander reacted instantly, all 5 tanks suddenly alert to the threat. The struck Tiger began to rotate its turret toward the source of the attack, while the other vehicles started their engines. "Easy 8 units, advance now," Jack commanded. "Draw their attention from the Firefly positions." Jack's driver gunned the engine, the Sherman lurching forward from its concealed position. The other 3 Easy Eights did the same, emerging from different points along the ravines and moving rapidly across the open ground between them and the German armor. The German commander, now faced with threats from multiple directions, made a critical error. Instead of concentrating his forces, he divided them, sending the Panthers to engage the advancing Easy Eights, while the Tigers focused on locating the source of the long-range fire. Firefly 2 and 3 engaged the Tigers. Easy Eights, evasive maneuvers, do not present stationary targets. The battle devolved into precisely the scenario Jack had envisioned. The Easy Eights used their superior mobility to force the Panthers into constant movement, making it difficult for them to acquire targets while exposing their thinner side armor to the watching Fireflies. Meanwhile, the Tigers, fixated on eliminating the Firefly that had already damaged one of them, remained largely stationary, presenting predictable targets. Within 10 minutes, 1 Tiger and 1 Panther were burning, struck by precisely aimed 17-pounder rounds from the Fireflies. The remaining German tanks began a fighting withdrawal, attempting to reach the cover of the forest. "They're falling back to the tree line," reported Cooper. "We'll lose clean shots if they reach cover." "Easy Eights, blocking positions," Jack ordered. "Don't let them reach the forest." Jack's driver accelerated, the Sherman's new suspension handling the rough terrain with remarkable stability as they moved to cut off the German retreat. The other Easy Eights followed suit, converging from different angles to force the German tanks back into the open. A Panther, cornered and desperate, turned to engage Jack's Sherman directly. At 400 yards, the Panther's 75mm gun could easily penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor. "Gunner, traverse left. Target Panther, fire when ready," Jack ordered calmly, even as he watched the German gun barrel aligning with his tank. The Sherman's 76mm gun fired a fraction of a second before the Panther. Jack's round struck the Panther's gun mantlet, not penetrating but causing enough damage to spoil the German tank's aim. The return shot passed just over the Sherman's turret. "Cooper, my Panther is damaged but still operational," Jack called into the radio. "Can you engage?" "Already on it, Lieutenant," came the calm reply. Seconds later, a 17-pounder round struck the Panther from the flank, penetrating its side armor and triggering a catastrophic internal explosion. The remaining Tiger and Panther, now outnumbered and caught in a deadly crossfire, attempted to break through the Easy 8 line. The Tiger managed to damage 1 Easy 8, a round from its 88mm gun penetrating the Sherman's lower hull and immobilizing it, though the crew survived. But the outcome wasn't inevitable. Caught between the long-range precision fire of the Fireflies and the aggressive maneuvers of the Easy-8s, the German tanks were systematically eliminated. The final Tiger, attempting to reach the forest, was struck simultaneously by fire from a Firefly and two Easy-8s, its ammunition detonating in a spectacular explosion that marked the end of Operation Anvil's strike. As the echo of the final explosion faded across the valley, Jack surveyed the battlefield through his binoculars. 5 German tanks destroyed, with only 1 Sherman immobilized and no casualties among his crews. It was a decisive victory against superior German armor, achieved through the coordinated application of complementary capabilities rather than raw firepower or numerical advantage. Cool. All units report, Jack called into the radio. One by one, the tank commanders confirmed their status. The injured Easy-8 crew was already being evacuated, while the remaining tanks secured the battlefield. Captain Wilson's jeep appeared over the ridge, the British officer standing to survey the scene as his driver navigated the shell craters and debris. "Impressive, Lieutenant," Wilson said as he approached Jack's Sherman. "Textbook execution of your integrated tactics." "The men made it work," Jack replied, climbing down from the turret. "They understood the concept and executed it perfectly." Wilson nodded, then lowered his voice. "General Armstrong's observer is just behind me. He witnessed the entire engagement. I believe your theory of complementary deployment has been rather conclusively demonstrated." Jack felt a mixture of satisfaction and caution. The tactical evidence is clear. Whether that translates to strategic policy remains to be seen. "Oh, I think you've made your point rather emphatically," Wilson said, gesturing to the smoking remains of German armor scattered across the battlefield. 5 elite German tanks destroyed with minimal losses. That's the kind of result that even the most stubborn traditionalist can't ignore. Later that evening, as Jack composed his after-action report in the command tent, he was interrupted by the arrival of Major General Armstrong himself. The general entered without ceremony, removing his gloves as he studied the map of the engagement. "Lieutenant Caldwell," Armstrong said by way of greeting, "my observer provided a detailed account of your operation today. Most impressive." "Thank you, sir," Jack replied, standing at attention. "At ease, Lieutenant." Armstrong continued to study the map. "Your tactical approach was unconventional, using 2 different Sherman variants in specialized roles rather than as interchangeable units." "Yes, sir. The Firefly's superior penetration capability combined with the Easy-8's mobility created tactical opportunities that neither variant could have achieved alone." Armstrong nodded slowly. "So I observed. It contradicts our doctrine of standardization and simplification." "With respect, sir, sometimes the simplest approach isn't the most effective." The general raised an eyebrow. "Bold statement from a lieutenant. Based on combat results, sir, not theory." Armstrong studied Jack for a long moment. "Your final Thunderbolt Duel recommendation will be to maintain both variants in complementary deployment, I assume?" "Yes, sir. The evidence supports that conclusion." "Despite the logistical complications, the training requirements, the manufacturing complexity?" Jack stood firm. "Those are real challenges, sir, but they're administrative problems with administrative solutions. The tactical advantage of complementary capabilities is a combat multiplier that directly saves lives and wins engagements." Armstrong was silent for a moment, then surprised Jack with a thin smile. "You've made your case compellingly, Lieutenant, both on paper and in combat. I won't pretend it's the recommendation certain parties were hoping for, but it's difficult to argue with results like today's." He extended his hand. "Your report will receive serious consideration at the highest levels. That's all I can promise." "That's all I ask, sir," Jack replied, shaking the general's hand. After Armstrong departed, Captain Wilson entered the tent. "How did it go with the general?" "Better than expected," Jack admitted. "He seemed genuinely impressed by the results." Wilson nodded. "As he should be. But you should know that even with Armstrong's support, there will be resistance to your recommendations. Too many resources already committed to standardization." "I understand that," Jack said, "but we've proven the concept works. Whether they implement it fully now or learn the lesson later, the truth is established." "The truth," Wilson repeated thoughtfully, "a rare commodity in war." Jack returned to his report, adding a final conclusion that would eventually find its way into post-war armored doctrine. The future of armored warfare lies not in pursuing a single perfect weapons platform, but in developing complementary systems that, when employed together, create capabilities greater than the sum of their parts. The Sherman Firefly and M4A3E8 Easy 8 represent different but equally valid approaches to the challenges of modern tank warfare. Together, they offer a tactical flexibility that neither can provide alone. Colonel Robert Caldwell set down the final report, deeply moved by his father's clarity of vision. In those words written in 1944, Jack Caldwell had articulated principles that would eventually become foundational to modern combined arms doctrine: the integration of complementary capabilities to create battlefield advantages that no single weapon system could achieve alone. Dr. Hughes, who had been reviewing other documents nearby, looked up at Caldwell's thoughtful expression. "You found what you were looking for?" "I found no more than that," Caldwell replied. "I found the genesis of ideas that shaped my entire military career, written by my father 75 years ago." He showed her the final page of Jack's report. This concept of complementary capabilities is now central to modern armored doctrine. We no longer expect a single tank to do everything. We design systems that work together, each covering the other's vulnerabilities. Dr. Hughes smiled. "So your father was ahead of his time." "By decades," Caldwell confirmed, and he stood by his conclusions despite enormous pressure to conform to the prevailing standardization doctrine. "That must have taken considerable courage," she observed. "More than I realized," Caldwell said quietly. "It explains a lot about his career path and his reluctance to discuss his wartime service. Standing up to generals rarely leads to rapid promotion, even when you're proven right in the long run." As Caldwell continued organizing the materials, preparing them for proper archival storage, Dr. Hughes placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Colonel, the museum would be honored to host an exhibition about Thunderbolt Duel. The technical aspects would interest military historians, but the human story, your father's moral courage and foresight, would resonate with everyone. Would you consider serving as a consultant?" Caldwell looked up, momentarily surprised, then nodded slowly. "I'd be honored. This story deserves to be told. Not just the technical comparison of tank variants, but the larger lesson about integrity and moral courage in the face of institutional pressure." "Exactly what I was thinking," Hughes agreed. "We could open the exhibition on Veterans Day. That gives us 6 months to prepare." The next 6 months passed in a blur of activity as Caldwell divided his time between compiling his father's story and reaching out to the families of other Thunderbolt Duel participants. Margaret Wilson provided additional letters and photographs from her father's collection. Frank Thompson recorded hours of oral history about the project. Even Colonel Richard Bennett contributed, sharing previously classified materials about the political dimensions of the project. Through it all, Caldwell found himself developing a relationship with his father that had never been possible in life, understanding the young lieutenant's thought processes, appreciating his moral courage, and recognizing how his pioneering work had shaped armored warfare doctrine for generations to come. On the morning of the exhibition opening, Caldwell stood alone in the gallery, surveying the displays before the public would be admitted. The centerpiece was a large diorama showing a Firefly and Easy 8 working in tandem during Operation Anvil Strike, their complementary capabilities illustrated through lighting and annotations. Nearby, interactive displays explained the technical differences between the two Sherman variants, with actual components: a 17-pounder breech, an HVSS suspension unit, ammunition samples, available for visitors to examine. But the heart of the exhibition, in Caldwell's view, was the human story told through photographs, letters, and personal effects. Jack Caldwell's field notebook opened to his observations about crew fatigue in the Firefly. Colonel Wilson's pipe displayed beside his handwritten notes on the Easy 8's performance in muddy terrain. Frank Thompson's combat decorations and the unit patch of the experimental armored group that had executed Operation Anvil Strike. "Quite impressive," came a voice from behind him. Caldwell turned to find Frank Thompson being wheeled into the gallery by an attendant from his veterans' home, the old soldier's eyes bright as he took in the exhibition. "Frank," Caldwell said warmly, stepping forward to shake the man's hand, "I wasn't sure you'd make it." "Wouldn't have missed it for the world," Thompson replied. "Someone needs to make sure you got the story straight." Caldwell laughed. "I had an excellent primary source." Thompson's gaze moved across the displays, lingering on the photographs of young men with their tanks. "God, we were just kids, weren't we? Making decisions that generals should have been making." "That's part of the story we're telling," Caldwell assured him. "How a lieutenant had the courage to stand by his convictions when it would have been easier to tell the brass what they wanted to hear." Thompson nodded, then pointed to the central diorama. You got the positioning right. Jack always insisted the Fireflies take hull-down positions, while the Easy Eights did the maneuvering. Said it played to the strengths of both designs. That principle is now doctrine, Caldwell said. Different platforms with different capabilities, integrated into a combined arms approach. Jack would be pleased to know that, Thompson said quietly, though he'd never say so himself. More guests began to arrive. Military historians, current and retired Tank Corps officers, representatives from the British Embassy, and even several family members of the original Thunderbolt Duel participants. Margaret Wilson had flown in from London, elegant and dignified, as she examined the British contributions to the project. At 11 o'clock, the museum director invited everyone to be seated for the formal opening ceremony. Caldwell found himself called to the podium to say a few words. Looking out at the assembled guests, he felt a momentary nervousness, then a calm certainty about what needed to be said. The story of Thunderbolt Duel is, on its surface, about two variants of the Sherman tank, the British Firefly and the American Easy 8. Each represented a different philosophy of tank design. The Firefly prioritized firepower. The Easy 8 balanced mobility with improved armament. For decades, historians have debated which approach was superior. Caldwell paused, looking at the diorama behind him. But what my father, Lieutenant Jack Caldwell, discovered through rigorous testing and actual combat experience was that this was fundamentally the wrong question. It wasn't about which tank was better, but how their different capabilities could complement each other on the battlefield. He gestured to the technical displays. The Firefly could destroy a Tiger tank at ranges the Easy 8 couldn't match. The Easy 8 could maintain combat effectiveness in conditions that would exhaust a Firefly crew. Together, they created tactical options that neither could provide alone. Caldwell's gaze moved to the personal artifacts of the men who had participated in Thunderbolt Duel. But beyond the technical lessons, there's a human story here that resonates across generations. It's about a young officer who refused to simplify a complex reality just because it would have been politically convenient, who insisted on reporting what he actually observed, even when powerful interests preferred a different conclusion, who understood that his recommendations would directly impact the survival of tank crews facing superior German armor. He looked at Frank Thompson, who nodded encouragingly. My father never spoke about his role in Thunderbolt Duel. Like many of his generation, he considered his service simply as duty performed. But through this exhibition, we can finally acknowledge the contributions of all those involved, their technical innovation, tactical insight, and most importantly, their moral courage. After the ceremony concluded and the exhibition opened to the public, Caldwell found a quiet moment with Frank Thompson near a display of operational maps from Operation Anvil Strike. There's one thing I still don't understand, Caldwell said. If my father's recommendations were so clearly validated by combat results, why weren't they fully implemented before the end of the war? Thompson sighed. Politics, production schedules, institutional inertia. By the time Jack's reports worked their way up the chain of command and overcame the resistance, the European war was nearly over. Some units did adopt his complementary deployment tactics, particularly Patton's Third Army, but the full implementation had to wait for Korea and beyond. A missed opportunity, Caldwell observed. Many were in war, Thompson agreed, but the lessons weren't lost, just delayed. Your father's insights eventually became standard doctrine. That's a legacy few lieutenants can claim. As the day progressed, Caldwell was approached by numerous visitors, many of them current or former tank commanders who recognized the significance of what the exhibition represented. A colonel from the Armor School at Fort Benning requested permission to develop a teaching module based on the Thunderbolt Duel findings for officer candidate training. But the most meaningful encounter came late in the afternoon, when an elderly gentleman in a British Army uniform approached Caldwell with a leather case tucked under his arm. "Colonel Caldwell?" the man said in a crisp accent. "Brigadier James Harrington, retired, Royal Tank Regiment." Caldwell shook the offered hand. "An honor, Brigadier." "The honor is mine," Harrington replied. "Your father saved my life, though he never knew it." "I don't understand." Harrington opened the leather case to reveal a tarnished piece of metal approximately 8 inches long. "This is a fragment from a 17-pounder shell that destroyed a Tiger tank outside Eisenborn Ridge in January 1945. My Cromwell tank had been disabled, and the Tiger was bearing down on our position when a Firefly positioned according to what they called Caldwell's tactic engaged and destroyed it." He carefully handed the fragment to Caldwell. The deployment strategy your father developed, Fireflies in Overwatch positions supporting faster tanks and maneuver roles, became standard practice in our sector after Operation Anvil Strike. It saved countless lives, including my own. Caldwell accepted the fragment with a deep sense of humility. I had no idea his tactics were implemented that widely. Not officially, perhaps, Harrington said with a small smile, but good ideas spread quickly at the front, regardless of what headquarters thinks. Tank commanders talked to each other, shared what worked. Your father's approach worked, so it spread. He gestured to the shell fragment. I'd like you to have this, a tangible piece of your father's legacy. As the exhibition closed for the day and the visitors departed, Caldwell remained behind, the shell fragment still in his hands. He found himself standing before a large photograph of his father, the same image he had first seen at the beginning of his journey, showing the young lieutenant standing between a Firefly and an EZ-8. Now, however, he saw the image with new eyes. What had once seemed like a simple historical photograph now revealed layers of meaning. The thoughtful expression on his father's face no longer appeared distant or reserved, but contemplative, the look of a man weighing difficult choices, aware of the lives that hung in the balance. Father Hughes approached quietly, respecting his moment of reflection. A successful opening, she said. The exhibition has already received coverage in several military history publications. Caldwell nodded absently, his attention still on the photograph. You know, he said after a moment, I spent my entire career in tanks. Commanded them in Desert Storm, helped develop doctrine at the armor school, advised on the development of the M1A2. All that time, I thought I was forging my own path. He held up the shell fragment. Now I discovered that I was following in footsteps laid down decades earlier by a man who never spoke of his achievements. Perhaps that's the greatest legacy, Dr. Hughes suggested. Not the recognition or the accolades, but the enduring impact of one's work, passed forward through generations. Caldwell considered this, then carefully placed the shell fragment in the display case beside his father's photograph. This belongs here, he said, part of the story. As he prepared to leave, Caldwell took one final look around the exhibition that chronicled not just the technical comparison of two Sherman variants, but a more profound narrative about integrity, moral courage, and the complex relationship between men and the machines of war. In telling his father's story, he had discovered something essential about himself, the source of his own unwavering commitment to protecting the men under his command, his insistence on realistic training over doctrine, his belief that technology should serve soldiers rather than the other way around. All principles he had absorbed without realizing their origin. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the museum grounds as Caldwell walked to his car. He carried with him not just a deeper understanding of his father, but a renewed appreciation for the quiet heroism of the World War II generation. Men who did their duty without expectation of recognition or reward, whose hard-won wisdom continued to save lives decades after their own battles had ended. The debate over which Sherman variant was superior, Firefly or EZ-8, had never been resolved because it had always been the wrong question. The real lesson of Thunderbolt Duel was that true effectiveness came not from choosing one approach over another, but from understanding how different capabilities could work together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. It was a lesson with applications far beyond armored warfare, a principle that applied to nations, to armies, and ultimately to the relationship between fathers and sons. Different strengths, different perspectives, coming together to form something stronger and more resilient than either could achieve alone. As he drove away from the museum, Caldwell felt a sense of completion. He had begun this journey seeking to understand his father's role in a technical evaluation of two tank variants. He ended it having discovered a legacy that spanned generations, a legacy not just of tactical innovation, but of moral courage and unwavering integrity in the face of pressure to compromise. The question of which Sherman was the real game changer had been answered, though not in the way anyone had expected. It wasn't the Firefly with its powerful 17-pounder gun, nor the EZ-8 with its balanced capabilities. The real game changer had been the insight that they were stronger together than apart, an insight that had saved lives in 1944 and continued to influence armored doctrine into the present day. And behind that insight stood a young lieutenant who had the courage to follow the evidence where it led, regardless of political pressure or career considerations. A man who placed the lives of tank crews above all other concerns. A father whose quiet example had shaped his son's life in ways neither could have imagined. In the end, the true legacy of Thunderbolt Duel wasn't about tanks at all. It was about the men who operated them, the officers who commanded them, and the enduring principles that guided their decisions in the crucible of combat. Principles that continued to resonate three-quarters of a century later, passed from father to son like a sacred inheritance. As the museum faded from view in his rearview mirror, Caldwell knew that the story of Thunderbolt Duel would no longer remain hidden in classified archives or unspoken memories. It would be shared, studied, and remembered, not just as a footnote in the history of armored warfare, but as a testament to the power of integrity, the value of complementary strengths, and the quiet heroism of a generation that changed the world without seeking credit for doing so. And in that knowledge, Colonel Robert Caldwell found a peace he had been seeking his entire life, a connection to the father he had never truly known. Forged through the shared experience of command and the common understanding that some principles transcend time, technology, and even the grave itself.